All right, everyone, welcome back. We have another special guest, Brian Lamanna. He's a mid-market account executive at Gong. If you don't follow his content, you should. That's how I ended up connecting with him. I somehow saw someone in my connections like his post, and I just went through a rabbit hole through his post. And I was like, wow, this is really tactical. So I had to get him on the show. And what I'm really excited about is we didn't really have a guest talk about how to get to the power and how to stay at the power, which is what we're going to talk about. So, how do you up level the conversations if you start with like a manager, director, or VP, and then go from there to getting the C suite involved? And again, we didn't have anyone really touch on this too much, and I think it's really needed. So, I'm glad we have Brian on. Welcome.
Thanks. I'm pumped to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. And so prior to this, prior to recording it, you were saying that you wanna before diving into like the steps, the tactical steps that you have, you want to provide some context as to like the why to provide some framework around it. So yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, true seller. I got to frame up the problem a little bit before I
Yeah.
come in with the solution. But don't worry, listeners. We'll have a five-step process that I'll jump to in just a second. But more, I think it's a great call out. Like the definition of getting to power has probably changed a little bit in the last couple of years. I think in 2020 when I was an AE, in 2021 when I was an account executive, I could get deals across the finish line with a VP leading the charge on the initiative, or maybe even a director in some cases that had more pull within organizations. I think it's really important to just note that here in 2023, it's a different times out there, right? Whatever you want to refer to it as, but money's not as cheap. There's a lot more scrutiny over all tech spend and all investments. And what that's leading to is maybe in the past, right, that director or VP could have gotten a deal across the line for you or been that champion and economic buyer. But now it's really, really critical to get the C-suite involved in every single deal that you're working, or at least try to, right, to your fullest extent to maximize our chances of actually winning more deals. To pull that back a layer, I actually was just pulling data prior to this conversation with more on my own data and why it's so important to me in my sales processes. And my win rate is 3 times higher when I get the C-suite involved in the cycle versus when I'm at the VP level, the director level, or the manager level and down below. So super, super critical, and it's important to have a plan of attack.
So a couple of questions. The first one is you were saying that um back in the day before 2023, you could have the VP of sales do the selling for you and the buying for you, and that's changed. Were you still selling the same? Were you still mid market back then? Because I know for some SMB AEs, there is only usually one or two people max involved. You don't need to involve the C suite and this person and that person. Were you still selling mid market?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So in 2020 and 2021, I actually was selling more mid-market and enterprise level at a previous company. In parts of 2022, I was doing more SMB, but we have a pretty wide segment account. So of course depends on the situation, but I think in general, I think a rule of thumb, we sell to sales leaders over here at Gong, and I think a good rule of thumb is if you're talking to a director of sales and there is a VP of sales or a chief revenue officer that's at the company, you probably need to still move up and, quote unquote, get to power past that director level you're speaking to. But, if you're speaking with a VP and there's truly nobody above them other than the CEO, and that CEO is really not involved in the go-to-market side or the sales side, then that might be your end person at a smaller company in SMB.
Yeah, I'd imagine like a startup. A lot of startups have like a VP of sales, no CRO, and then direct CEO. Um,
Exactly.
and then the second question I had was you mentioned that your win rates were 3 times as higher when you got the C-suite involved in the sales cycle. At what point did you get them involved?
Yeah, it's a really good point of clarification as well. So, not at the very end, not at the 1 yard line, right? The goal is to get them involved earlier on in the process. And here at my current company at Gong, we go to market by way of pilot or like proof of concept pretty typically.
Like a free trial?
Uh, exactly, like a trial. Other orgs I know might just have more of a proposal stage, this mid to late stage. I think it's important to get them involved prior to that, whether it's a shorter exec level, conversation that's 15 or 20 minutes, but I'm always aiming to get them involved in some sort of like product demonstration that might feel too granular in some cases for someone of that level, but I want to get them involved, even if it's just a shorter demonstration, to show more through their perspective how they would get value and insight from the solution, more like mid to late stage, before we get into that pilot or before we get into a more formal proposal, to make sure that the value is really aligned and can get some executive buy-in early.
Interesting. I mean, and you may be going into this, but and I may be getting ahead of myself, but
Yeah.
do you find that, like, all right, I mean, like, ideally, yeah, getting the person that's essentially signing off on this at the end, like a CRO, to bring them in early on, but then someone, I mean, I've had AEs tell me like, yeah, I've tried it, but then the prospect would say something like, well, not yet. When the time comes, we'll bring it. It's too early.
Yeah.
Are you still getting that? And you're like, all right, when I have those sort of objections or whatever you want to call it, fine, it is what it is. Or you're like, no, you're still handling those types of objections on top of it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I push pretty hard and in a respectful way. And I think it's helpful to frame it up and kind of think about yourself, right? If you were in a buying type conversation with an account executive on the other side, like, could you get your manager or leader to a call if you really needed to? The answer is probably like yes, like you could get them, but you're only going to get that person involved if you're really, really confident that, like, A, this is a solution that can like definitely help us. And number two, you trust the AE on the other end you're talking to. They're showing up early, they're being prepared, they're respectful, they did their research, they're asking good questions, because you're putting your neck out on the line when you get your boss or your leader involved.
Yeah.
I really think about it through that lens, and that kind of goes into my 5-step process per se of how I get to power and cycles, because you need to nail each and every component for that buyer to want to trust you, right, and help enlist you to help sell this and ultimately get the product that they likely want right in their hands much more easily.
Yeah. Before we go into the 5-step process, there's something that you said that I was like, this could be helpful to say or ask on early discovery calls. And it was regarding, like, yeah, if you can, if you really needed to get like your manager or boss on the call, could you? The answer is yes. Um, you'd have to make a strong case because you're putting your neck on the line. One of the questions I'd like when I was selling software, but now I teach people how to sell better, but is like, essentially, whose idea was this? Like, is your CRO manager, whoever it is, are they aware that you're even evaluating something like this? Because a lot of times you get like a VP or whatever, main prospect, main champion, they're getting on a discovery call, demo, whatever you want to call it, and no one else in their department knows about it. And so you're assuming that the deal is already progressing forward just because you've done demo. So just a thought. But anyways, yeah, let's dive into the steps.
Yeah, and that's a great call. I think like the way to think about it is like there's two different buying cycles going on, and one, it's between you and who you're speaking to as your champion, but there's likely another one going on internally. So that question more you just posed, I think, is a really strong one. You can ask early on too, like, hey, is your CRO is Gong on their radar?
Yeah. Do they know who Gong is? How familiar are they yet?
Yeah, just something simple like that. Are they aware you're looking into it and
Yeah,
super
that's a big one. Yeah.
it can be casual. So into the 5 steps. So I try to follow this in really every single cycle. And we'll use the example again that I'm maybe on a call with a director of sales, but there's a VP of sales and a chief revenue officer at that company, and I want to work to get not past that director of sales, but just get other folks included in the conversation as well and earn their unique perspective. So where it all starts for me is step 1 is all around really, really strong pre-call prep. I know it's not the sexiest thing to talk about, but it's one of the most important things I do. I prep for a minimum of 20 minutes for every first call. It's typically closer to 30 minutes. And in that prep, one of the first things I do is I actually go to LinkedIn and I go to that company and I write out all of their execs' names in my notes. And I also write out any personas that would typically get involved in our sales process and their names as well. So just as an example, I'll write out CEO, Karen, right? Chief Revenue Officer, Jillian, Chief Technology Officer, Bob, Sales Operations Manager, Jimmy, right? Things like that, so on and so forth. Just chose some random names there. So
Poor Jimmy, Bob, and Karen.
as well. But it all starts with that pre-call prep and having that research really, really well, because I'm going to reference that later in my conversations with that director of sales. So that's step one around kind of the pre-call prep side of things.
And I assume that you said that listing all the execs name and the personas who typically get involved. I assume you only know that based on historic data of deals that did close and look and sort of reverse engineering who the buying committee were.
Exactly. Yeah. It's me referencing, hey, in my case, I typically have a sales leader involved, maybe somebody in revenue operations, maybe somebody in IT that could connect the systems, or somebody in security that might do a review at a later point. So I'm specifically searching for those types of roles. I'll also search just for basic things like, if there's any employees with that were at a past customer of ours, or if there's anyone that follows our company page on LinkedIn, just with some quick sales nav filters. So I'm just trying to find any tidbits of like maybe an additional champion or somebody that might be aware of our company. So I can come into that first conversation as warm and as researched as possible.
Cool. So step one, pre-call prep. As you can tell, I'm running my notes down here. Step two.
Yeah. Step two is about the upfront contract, right? So now we want to plant the seed in that very first conversation with, that director of sales in that example. And I'll use an upfront contract that references that there's really not power involved yet. So I'll say at the beginning of the call, hey, are we still good for 45 minutes? Perfectly. Typically this conversation has one of three different outcomes. If at the end of the call you're incredibly excited about what we have to offer, we'll generally schedule a greater demonstration with yourself, as well as someone like your CRO, Karen, and your VP of sales, David. Option number two, if you like what you see, but you want to learn more first, totally cool. Me and you can spend some more time getting deeper in the platform. Or option number three, if it's just not a fit or not a priority today, we can always part ways as friends. So I'm really giving them the option. If they love it, we'll do a greater demo, loop in more people. If they like it, but they're not there yet, totally cool. Or can part ways if it's just not a fit. So I'm setting that expectation early in the conversation that that's the best way that we'll go about next steps.
That's awesome. And do you find maybe the prospect won't say explicitly, but maybe their body language or their tonality, saying something like, who are you to tell me what the next step, what the three, next steps could be? Like, I'll decide. I'm the buyer. Like, you don't tell me what to do. Do you ever get that vibe from the call?
Yeah, I typically don't actually. And I think that would be a concern of mine as well. But I think if anything, they'll be really impressed. And again, I try to put myself in their shoes. If they knew my manager and my leader's name above them coming into that first conversation, I would be like, wow, this person on the other end, like they did their homework, they know what they're speaking about. And at the end of the day, it's just a recommendation that those are typically the three outcomes I would suggest and I would recommend. But certainly am willing to partner with who we're speaking to on the other end, as well as the buyer, and get their input after I make a recommendation.
And second and last question for step two, do you think it matters what the buying scenario is? So in other words, if the prospect is looking at, let's say, Gong for the first time, they've never used call recording software ever in their life. This is the first time. So they don't know what they don't know. They really don't know how to maybe buy software like this, versus someone that's used a competitor of yours and now they're looking at Gong. Well, they've gone, they've done the rodeo before. They know what's involved. Do you think that matters how you pitch it, that upfront contract, or it's all the same regardless?
I typically keep it pretty uniform. I think you can tweak it a little bit, kind of depending on the different situations and scenarios. But if I'm not at power at the end of the day, my first outcome is going to be expanding the conversation and getting others involved. My second outcome will always be just more time one-on-one. I'm always happy to do that. And that's a pretty likely outcome as well. And then option three will always be just shaking hands. So the details can definitely change a little bit within them, but usually follows that.
Cool. All right. So we got step one again, pre-call prep. Step two, upfront contract, plant the seed. Step three.
Step three, you got to crush the call. And that's the fun part. I call that building trust, right? So it's building trust. It's crushing the call, whether it's a discovery call, whether it's a demo. But it's doing little things to build up that trust throughout. And I'll give a couple examples. One is I like to insert some of my pre-call prep throughout the call to continue to show that I've done homework. So as an example, instead of just showing up and saying, hey, more, what are your top 2 to 3 priorities you have to nail? I might say, hey, more, I was doing a little bit of research into the company. I saw you just launched this brand new product. You brought on this new leader on the marketing side. Some really big things are happening. Like, talk to me about your top initiatives. So it's really just the framing of all of your questions, being able to like insert a little pre-call prep before you ask that question. You'd be amazed at how you get a vastly different answer than just asking something boring, like what keeps you up at night.
Yeah, that's interesting. I love that. I mean, I talk about that a lot also. It's like show them what you already know about them, but don't necessarily point out the obvious, but show them that you're able to connect the dots. Cool.
Yeah, and don't pigeonhole it either. Like I like to insert a little pre-call prep and then still ask the open-ended question, because you don't want to pigeonhole the conversation to the one thing you found on Google or the one thing you
Yeah.
found with 10K. So I think it's important to show up with some point of view, some research, but you can say something along the lines of like, hey, it looks like this new product is a really, really large strategic initiative. Like, is that the number one thing that we have to nail here in 2023? Or like, what trumps that as being even more important in your world? And you get a really good scenario where either number one, they just reaffirmed your research as their number one priority and you can dig deeper, or they're willing to probably give you and uncover something more, something that is, quote unquote, keeping them up at night because they're just impressed in the first place that, you
Yeah.
did your homework and showed up with that.
That's awesome. All right, let's go to step 4.
Cool.
By the way, this is tactical, exactly how the audience likes it.
Yeah, I keep things super, super tactical, sometimes probably too much.
No, it's great.
But glad the audience will hopefully be loving this. Number 4 is all about planting the seed. So as I go through that conversation, whether it's, first call discovery, first call demo, I'm trying to start to plant the seed that like what we're discussing doesn't just impact who I'm speaking to on the other end. So there's 3 questions I'll typically try to kind of plant throughout the call, but I'll say something along the lines of like, hey, what would this allow your team to do differently if we were to solve for this? If there's ever a wow moment, I'll ask something like, hey, who else would get value from being able to leverage something like X, Y, and Z?
Yeah.
And then the third one is like, if we're ever getting deep in pain and different challenges, I'll say like, hey, what are the ripple effects of like this XYZ challenge right here across the rest of your team? So I'm naturally broadening out the conversation and giving an avenue to, again, plant the seed and hopefully leverage like, hey, it's also really affecting blank in marketing or this person in product because, in my world, they can't understand the true voice of the customer. So I'm starting to warm up the conversation that we're more of a strategic solution versus just a solution just for you on the other end.
Yeah, and I imagine that's where you're also sprinkling in the pre-call prep, saying something like, typically, based on this particular challenge, I've had XYZ company have their marketing team, whatever, being impacted by this. I would imagine that's the case for you. Cool.
Nailed it. Yeah. And call out their name too. Don't be scared. The first time I leveraged something like that, I was like, are they gonna, be taken aback? And if they are, it'll probably be in a good way and be like, hey, I saw you have a new marketing leader that joined 7 months ago. Typically, new marketing leaders trying to understand the voice of the customer as well when they first join a company. Is that challenge? Have they brought that up at all to you? Could you see this being beneficial to Jim?
Yeah, I mean, it makes it easier when you don't have to like tell your story from the beginning on a demo that you're probably doing for the 5th time with another company. And when you have a salesperson coming in, they've done their homework, they're telling you like they understand your world. It's like, oh my gosh, it's so much easier to evaluate software. Take us home. Step 5.
Step 5. This is a fun one. You just have to make the ask, right? You need to be confident in the delivery and how you close out the call. So one, you certainly need to have enough time at the end of a call. Really, really important prerequisite. But I'll typically close out the call just saying, something soft to start, like, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, I know you mentioned XYZ was a top priority. How compelling was today? What would make that a 10? And then I'll ask, hey, Moore, are you open to a recommendation on my end? And I'll pause and I'll wait for them to say yes, so I get a little bit of buy-in. And then I'll go ahead and make the recommendation from that menu of 3 options, what I think fits them best, right? I'm going to be super prescriptive. So I might say, hey, Moore, given you said it was an 8, let's set up a greater demo with you as well as Karen and Jim to also bring their unique perspective into the fold on this as well. Are you in agreement on that?
That's awesome. I love it. So you're asking you're asking them if they're open to a recommendation based on their answer for B, which is asking for alignment at the end. Essentially asking for alignment is like asking for fit. Like that's awesome. I love that. I love the mapping there.
Yeah, and like imagine, I again try to put myself in the other shoes, but I'll give a scenario. But imagine you go to the doctor's office, you spend 45 minutes with the doctor, and at the end, they ask you instead, they're like, "Oh, what do you think you should do for next steps? Like, what are you thinking works best?" Like, you're going to them for a reason because you have a problem, you have a challenge, you want them to be prescriptive and actually prescribe, excuse the pun there, like exactly what you need to get better and move this along and move forward as long as you're bought in up until that point. So just don't be afraid to make that prescription. The worst thing that happens, I think, is they just say, hey, I don't think we're there yet. We're not at that point. I would feel uncomfortable just throwing this on our calendar, and you get some more time with them one-on-one to go deeper or share whatever you need to. But don't be afraid to make that ask. If you've crushed the call, you've planted the seed, you've set the expectation up front with the upfront contract, you put your work into all the prep that was needed, you got to have the confidence to go for the kill.
Yeah, I mean, this is awesome. I'm not gonna lie, I'm probably gonna have it for like a part 2 where we discuss like what happens when you get pushback and resistance. But this is
Yeah.
good enough, great enough for part 1. Um, yeah, I usually, if you want to plug yourself in, and where can someone find you?
Yeah, on I post once a day on LinkedIn.
Yeah, you do.
I started June of 2022, and I post a very tactical stuff relating to all full cycle selling of prospecting all the way through closing. So probably right in line with our audience listening
Yep.
to this
Yep.
now. And then number 2, I write a newsletter that's weekly that you can find in my bio as well, where I
Yeah,
just
and I'll
go.
link it also in the description.
Amazing. Yeah, I just go even more in depth and more tactical on a new topic, and I bring in different special guests as well.
Sweet. Awesome, man. I appreciate it.
Awesome.